Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC EduSec live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we talk on different subjects, different topics, so as to cater to your needs for learning different topics with the various aspects and various perspectives. Dear friends, in this session today we would be talking on Paris Climate Conference, and for this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Rajan Kumar. Dr. Rajan Kumar is Associate Professor in School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dear friends, Dr. Rajan has immense experience, as well as I would like to tell you all that he is one of the popular academician among the students, and the students always desire to learn more and more from him, because the way he put examples so as to prove the various aspects and perspectives that becomes wholesome and very productive. So we are waiting for a very productive session once again by Dr. Rajan Kumar. So I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Geetika, and that was very nice introduction. I don't really know that whether I deserve that kind of introduction, but again, I have to start with the topic today. The topic is Paris Climate Conference. As you know that Paris recently, in the month of December, there was a conference, and very famous international conference, which is known as the Paris Climate Conference. And there 196 members agreed to come to a decision on the issue of climate change. And there are a lot of issues that we'll discuss. What are the issues? As you know, the main issue was the issue of global warming. And what are the main causes of global warming? The main causes of global warming, as you know, that is the greenhouse gas emission, which is done by the number of countries, and primarily the developed countries, because of the industrialization and other reasons. The greenhouse gas emission is the main culprit for the issue of global warming. And greenhouse gas is any gaseous compound in atmosphere that is capable of absorbing infrared radiation, and that traps heat, and that leads to kind of heating of the atmosphere, and that heating is known as the global warming. And global warming can have a very disastrous, catastrophic impact. People argue that it can lead to some kind of this rising of the sea level, and many of the island countries might submerge in the sea. It can also lead to some of the other impacts, like the forest fire that has happened in Australia, that has happened in Russia, and also in other countries. So greenhouse can have a really catastrophic impact in the international climate and atmosphere. And the issue of this climate change, it was being discussed for a very long time, but the real process of negotiation started in the 1990s. When the first conference was Rio. You might have heard about it, Rio de Janeiro, that conference on climate change under the framework of United Nations. And then again a few years later it was in Kyoto, Japan, where the number of countries met, and they tried to come to a conclusion. Again that did not succeed because of several reasons that we'll discuss in today's lecture. And after that it was also in the Copenhagen conference, that was in 2009. Then again this issue was discussed, but again the legally binding treaty was not signed. And finally we have this Paris Climate Conference. It's also known as Conference of Parties, COP21. That's the popular title that you might see in the newspapers and the media. So what is this issue of global warming all about? People, there are two sides of it. Some of the people argue that the global temperature has been increasing because of the massive industrialization which happened in the 20th century and even before that. But there are other sides of it. Some of the scholars also argue that the climate change is not taking place. They do not believe that the kind of this temperature which is rising, that is because of the industrialization. But majority and the mainstream scholar, the majority of the scholars agree to the fact that the temperature has risen in the atmosphere in the last 100 years or so. In fact, the issue was also discussed in 19th century, but there was no systematic explanation why that was happening. But recently, because of certain impacts, some of the changes in the climate, because the average temperature of atmosphere has been rising, and people believe that if this temperature rises beyond 2 degrees Celsius, so that might lead to catastrophic impact in the atmosphere, and it will lead to a massive climate change which will impact all the countries in the world. And if you want to understand it slightly better, then the difference between the Ice Age, which was the period when there was no existence of human being, the difference between the Ice Age and the today's climate, the difference is of just 5 degrees. And if we do not take certain measures to stop the emission of greenhouse gases, so that will lead to an increase of 5 degrees Celsius increase in the temperature of the atmosphere, and the Earth or the planet cannot sustain that kind of increase in the temperature. That will lead to the melting of the ice, that will lead to rising in the sea level, that will lead to a lot of fires. The countries which are warm will become warmer, that will impact the monsoon, that will impact almost everything on the planet. So that's the reason 196 countries agreed to come to a table and talk on the issue of climate change. And Paris conference took place in December, just last year, 1 month earlier, December, in the first 2 weeks of December. And there it was culmination of a number of other agreements which were signed earlier. But Paris is historic. It was taken as a landmark because number of countries, including India, they agreed to cut down the emission. They set up a target and they agreed to decide on the target. In the earlier meetings, earlier conferences, always the controversy was that the developing countries were setting certain targets which were not acceptable by the developed country, and developed country vis-a-vis the developing countries. So that was a contest taking place in the earlier meetings. The developing countries like India and China will not agree to the targets set by developed countries like United States, Australia, UK, France, etc. So that was the main reason why the earlier conferences failed in different ways. In today's lecture, I'll discuss about global warming a little. I'll also talk about greenhouse gas emission, and then how to cut down emission of this greenhouse gases, which was the discussion in Paris conference also, and what are the rules which have been framed in the Paris conference regarding the cutting down the emission of the greenhouse gases, and what are the enforcement mechanism, and what are the enforcement agreements, and how to enforce these agreements. These are the major issues of discussion in today's lecture. So briefly understand the global warming. If the temperature rises above threshold, 2 degrees Celsius is supposed to be the threshold, 2 degree compared to the pre-industrial level of the temperature, that is supposed to be threshold. And if the temperature rises beyond 2 degrees Celsius, that will have a catastrophic and irreversible impact on the global climate. And it is argued by the scientists that if the current emission continues, it will lead to an increase of nearly 5 degrees Celsius increase in the temperature. And please note that by now there is already an increase of 1 degree Celsius from the pre-industrial period. And when I talk of the pre-industrial period, basically I mean the entire 20th century, and the entire process of industrialization started in the late 19th century and it continued in the 20th century. So basically, the pre-industrial period would refer to the first half of the 19th century. But the skeptics, the people who do not believe in the climate change, some of the people argued that the climate change is not taking place, and they give the example that since 1998 the global temperature has risen at a slower pace than the previous 30 years. That is true, that the global temperature has risen at a slower pace, but even then the global temperature has risen. There is no disagreement on the rise of the global temperature. There is a disagreement on how much actual increase has taken place. As I told you, 2 degree would mean that a complete destructive rise in the sea level threaten the existence of island like Bangladesh, Marshall's Island, and it might also devastate the Great Barrier Reef, which is important for maintaining the climate in the international global planet. What are the previous agreements, because Paris conference that you had on the climate change, that was the culmination of a number of previous agreements which have taken place. I'll start with the Rio. The first conference took place in 1992 under the framework of United Nations. That was in Rio de Janeiro, where it was known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There they talked of certain motives, they talked of certain actions, but how to implement, that was not clear. So it was more like expression of intention rather than any enforcement or any action on the ground. it bound the government to take steps, but not clear what steps the government will take. So, the kind of elaboration, the kind of clarity which was needed, or kind of enforcement mechanism that was needed to implement these the agreements, that was not provided in the Rio de Janeiro agreement on the climate change. The second agreement took place in Kyoto in 1997, which is known as the Kyoto Protocol. Here the worldwide it was agreed that there will be a worldwide cut in emission of by 5% compared to 1990 level by 2012. But there are two problems with this Kyoto Protocol. First is that the important countries like Russia and United States, they did not ratify this agreement of Kyoto. Kyoto had a very strong legally binding provisions in terms of implementation, but since the main countries like United States and Russia, they did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, so it never came into picture. And also it did not have provisions for the setting of the targets for developing countries like China, India, Mexico, South Africa, etc. So, because of those reasons, Kyoto Protocol, although important in a different way, but it was never implemented. In fact, if you read the newspapers of that period, Russia argued that if there is a rise in temperature, that will lead to that will help Russia, that will help the agriculture of Russia. So, that was kind of argument given by Russia in that period, after in the first in the beginning of this century, 21st century. But later on in 2004, because Russia wanted to become the member of WTO and European Union countries were putting pressure on Russia. So, finally, Russia signed the provisions of Kyoto Protocol in 2004. But before that, the argument of Russia, as I told you, was very different. Because Russia is a cold country, and Russia felt that in case there is a rise in temperature, so that will help Russia regain some of the ice covered agricultural land. But finally, some of the impacts of climate change was also visible in Russia later. In 2010, for instance, there was a forest fire. There was a very strong heat wave in Russia, and that led to a forest fire in Russia. So, finally, Russia also came to the conclusion that climate change can adversely impact the agriculture as well as other aspects of Russian life, and finally, they agreed to this. And that was again taken as a turning point, because Russia agreed, and then gradually United States also started playing a very positive role. When Obama came to power in 2009, so in Copenhagen he could not do much, although he tried his best to make the Copenhagen Agreement successful, but he could not help much. But second term, when he was elected in 2013, so he pledged that this would be in the second term of his presidential regime, the climate change will be one of his important priorities, and he started cutting down emissions. He started checking the emissions of the coal generated power sector and other industries, and it set in tone a very strong message. He also said in one of the addresses to the Congress that if Congress does not ratify does not ratify the climate change protocols, then he will have to take presidential measures. He will have to take certain other actions, and Obama showed his passion for this climate change in the second presidential term. So, these were some of the these are some of the reasons why this later Paris conference succeeded. In the earlier, US President Al Gore had signed the Kyoto Protocol, but it was never ratified by the Congress, US Congress, which is necessary. And there was also a provision in the Kyoto Protocol that if 55% of global emission by the different countries is not ratified, so then this Kyoto Protocol will not come into play. As a result, since US is the biggest emitter of the carbon dioxide gas, so since US did not ratify it, so the Kyoto Protocol failed to come into play, failed to succeed. And then again after this Kyoto, in 2007 there was a meeting at Bali which also set a new course, and then finally the 2009 Copenhagen conference where members agreed on emission, but treaty could not be signed due to the last minute chaos. Obama tried his best. He went to meet the Chinese premier, he met Indian delegate and other people also, but the distinction or the division which was there between the developing countries and the developed countries, so that remained. The developed country wanted to set a common target for all the countries, but that was not agreeable to the developing countries like India and China, because the Western countries have already achieved a level which is very high from the developing countries level, for instance India and China. So developing countries wanted that that the target cannot be same for the developed country and the developing countries, and also they wanted some kind of financial support and technological support from the developed world, and US was not willing to provide the financial support, while US wanted to fix the same target for China, India and the developed countries. So that kind of uniform rule was not acceptable to the developing countries, and developing countries wanted a differential kind of agreement where the target levels for developing world would be different, and these countries will also be provided with clean technology, which are very, very expensive, because clean technology is also controlled by the developed countries, and they are not willing to provide the companies from the West, they are not willing to provide developing countries with the cheap technology, cheap clean green technology, which is required for cutting down the emission in the developing countries. So that was the main reason why developing countries were not willing to set the target. They were against the uniformity of the norm for all the countries, and they always wanted some kind of financial support from the Western countries, which are the main culprits of this emission of the carbon greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's important to understand what is the background of this Paris conference and the reason why this Paris conference succeeded. Here European Union agreed to cut down the emissions by 40% of the level of 1990. The United States also agreed to cut down emission by nearly 26 to 28% of the 2005 level, and the turning point in this climate negotiation was China. Earlier China was not agreeing, and China is, in today's world, China is the second largest emitter of the gas, of the greenhouse gas, and if China does not agree in today's context, then any deal on climate may not succeed. Similarly, India was also not willing to succeed. But what happened in this, the back channel diplomacy, the kind of role it plays in negotiation. The diplomats from France, especially the negotiator on climate change from France and the minister, they visited a number of countries throughout the world, and they tried to come to some kind of informal agreement before all these leaders come on the table at Paris in 2015 December. Nations with 90% emissions agreed for some kind of voluntary cuts of the greenhouse gases, and there is also an understanding that these pledges will hold the world to about 2.7% to 3%, 2.7 degrees Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius of warming. As I told you that the threshold which has been set by the scientists, that threshold should not be more than 2 degrees Celsius. But even after the kind of promises which have been made at Paris conference, that will not stop the rise of temperature below 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius. But the beauty of the Paris conference is that even before the Paris conference, they agreed, most of the countries informally agreed for some kind of review mechanism, because whenever these kind of negotiations take place, the biggest problem is that the countries, in the interest of the nation because of the national interest, the countries do not try to implement these negotiations, and these international negotiations, they do not have a very clear-cut enforcement mechanism through which they can enforce the nations to implement these measures. As a result, some kind of review mechanism was necessary, and this was informally agreed before the Paris conference. Then the issue of finance, technology and support to poorer countries to invest in clean technology, these issues were also discussed before the Paris meeting. In fact, it was discussed in the Copenhagen also. In Copenhagen, for instance, there was a pledge of nearly $30 billion to the poor countries to be provided by the rich countries. That was agreed in the Copenhagen. So that spirit of some kind of support to the poorer countries continued, and that amount was also increased. As we will see that this amount from which is promised $30 billion, now that has been increased to nearly $100 billion in the Paris conference. In the background, just before this Paris conference, another important this event happened, and that kind of created a lot of fear in the mindset of the delegates and also the other people, whether this conference can happen without any kind of obstruction or not. And that was the terrorist attack which happened in Paris before this meeting was supposed to take place in the first 2 weeks of December. And that created a fear in the mind of the people, but because of the very strong message which was given by the French government, and also because of the security arrangement, finally this negotiation took place, and they came to a certain agreement which is taken as historic and which has been described as landmark agreement in terms of climate change negotiations. And there was another politics which was happening during that period. If you have been watching the TV TV in India or China or globally, for instance, in the first 2 weeks of December, you'll find that there is a lot of talk about pollution in New Delhi, in the city of New Delhi. There's also a lot of talk about the pollution in Beijing. So all these also created a mindset where people started asking for some kind of check on the emission of the carbon. In fact, in Delhi, if you remember, in December 2015, that was the time when the people started talking of this to check the emission of gases by the polluting cars and other industries in Delhi, and that was the time when the Delhi government decided to take a very unique measure of odd and even program, and for 15 days in January. In fact, some of the people argue that why these kind of pollutions were highlighted in the month of December. It was related to some kind of politics, because this the measure of pollution was the measurement was being done by the US Embassy, and some of the people argue that the US Embassy wanted to create some kind of pressure on the Indian, and they wanted to create a mindset among the Indian people so that they can put pressure on the government, or which can create the conducive environment for negotiation at Paris. So these are some of the things which you need to understand. Although there is no denying the fact that Delhi has a very high level of pollution in terms of emissions which are done by the polluting cars in Delhi, and also some of the industries which are located either in Delhi or outside in the NCR region. But how far this issue of pollution in Delhi was raised because of some inherent underlying political designs, so that is very difficult to prove. But some of the newspaper reports do talk about that. Now coming to the Paris conference and the kind of agreements which have taken place there, the most important achievement of Paris conference of parties, that's the COP, that's how it's known, COP 21, that's how it's referred to in the media. So it's most important thing is the legally binding instrument. The earlier Rio, Kyoto, or the Copenhagen, what was not done was the legally binding instrument. That was not signed, or even if that was signed, that was not finally ratified by the legislatures of the respective countries. But here the main difference that you see is the legally binding instrument, which that every country is legally bound to follow it, and if it does not follow, then there are certain measures through which the other countries can put pressure on these countries to follow the norms which have been agreed by the respective countries. Even if there is a change of government at the domestic level, these countries are legally bound to follow these norms. So that's one important achievement of this Paris conference. Second, here the countries offered voluntary targets with a very systematic review mechanism. And here it was not enforced by the developed countries. They did not set up the target. What is required was that every country will decide on the target. Of course, the major target was that it has to be below 2 degrees Celsius. So in that below 2 level target, every country has to decide that what would be the peaking year. Peaking in the sense when the country's emission reaches the level of the peak. So every country had to take a decision on this peaking year, and also every country had to decide that what would be the mechanism of cutting the emission in the future. So, China for instance picked up the year of 2030, that would be the culmination year, that would be the turning point for China, and after that China will start cutting down the emission. So, 2030 was picked up by China. Here and one important achievement of Paris was that it set up the target of controlling the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, but also the countries agreed that they will try to achieve the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was described as a landmark, because people thought that even achieving that target of 2 degrees Celsius would be something nearly impossible, given the kind of previous agreements that we had in Kyoto and in Copenhagen. But here they came to the conclusion the target would be 2%, but they will try to aspire to cap the temperature at the level of 1.5. So, that was very significant. 1.5 was very significant, although this at the level of inspiration, and achieving that will not be easy. But the fact that they have noted it down, they have kind of brought it in the agreement. So, that should be considered a significant achievement. Although the reality is that people argue that even now there is already 1 degree increase in the temperature from the pre-industrial level. In today's world, there is already 1 degree Celsius increase of temperature, and since the poorer countries are bound to emit more because of the requirement of cooking gas, electricity, power generation, burning of the coal, etc. So, because of that it would be impossible to achieve the target of 1.5. And if you want to reversing the process where it means that decreasing the gases which are there, the greenhouse gases which are there in the atmosphere, how do you reverse the process? That is something which is not certain, because the kind of technology that we have it today, reversing the process would be extremely difficult, because we have already emitted a huge amount of this carbon gases, greenhouse gases, and sucking that in would be a very difficult task. Although we cannot rule out the possibility when in future the countries develop certain technology which can suck in the existing greenhouse gases, but that at the moment is not certain. So, there is already a 1 degree increase, and there are millions of tons of these greenhouse gases already there in the temperature, and they are trapping the infrared radiations which are coming from the sun, and since they are being trapped, so that is leading to increase in the temperature in our atmosphere. Here in Paris, the most important thing was that the kind of resistance which was witnessed in the Copenhagen conference or even in the Kyoto or the earlier conferences, that was breached. These countries, the countries which are opposing and which had formed some kind of bloc, for instance India, China, Mexico, etc., Brazil. So, they came to some certain understanding, and they decided to negotiate where some kind of differentiated rules will be applicable for developing countries and the developed countries. Here Obama supported very strongly, and Obama supported, people say that Obama supported because he is not going to fight the next term presidential election in the United States. This is his second term, and he is going to retire after this. So, ultimately it was in his interest to promote the cause of this climate change, although the Congress is dominated by Republicans. So, they wanted some kind of agreement which would be acceptable to the Republican dominated Congress in the United States. But the turning point, of course, as I told you, the turning point was China. China, which was earlier not setting up the target, which was not willing to negotiate because of its requirement to grow. China also is a very highly populated country. China's requirement of industrialization is very high, and China needs a lot of energy through coal energy or the fossil fuel energy. So, for burning of that energy, burning of that fuel is very important for Chinese industrialization in future. So, China was earlier not willing, but in recently, and because of the US negotiations, Obama negotiated with China earlier, and also because the French government, they negotiated with China earlier. So, China came to some kind of understanding where China will try to replace the greenhouse emitting technology with the greener technology. And India was worried because India is still not very industrialized, and here the people are very poor. the cooking and the fuel requirement is very high in India, and India is less than 40% electrified. So, for the generation of electricity, India need to burn the coal. So, because of these reasons, India was not very keen to set a fixed target, and India was cooperating with China in earlier conferences, but India also agreed to cut down the emissions in the present conference. And the maximum pressure was coming from the island countries, which are really worried about their submerging in the sea. The island countries like Marshall Island, Bangladesh, Philippines and Vietnam, they campaigned very strongly for limiting the global warming to less than 1.5 degree Celsius. And these are the countries because they fear that if there is the temperature rises, the ice melting takes place in Arctic and other places. So, that will lead to rise in the sea level, and because these countries are low lying countries, so they will get submerged in the sea. The countries like Maldives, for instance, two of the countries in South Asia are very concerned about this. In fact, three countries, one is Maldives, second is Bangladesh and also Sri Lanka. So, these are the countries, small low lying countries. They kind of argued this very strongly for the adoption of the climate change agreement. And one important thing, if you see the kind of differences which were there in the Paris conference and the previous conferences, here it was not just the states which were negotiating. Some of the business groups under the Lima Paris Action Agenda, where business groups, they agreed to cut down the emission. Here the cities, many of the cities, they also agreed to cut down the emissions. And in this conference, nearly 114 big companies like Coca-Cola, Dell, Procter & Gamble, Sony, Walmart, etc. So, they agreed to cut down the emissions at their level. So, it is not just the state versus state which were negotiating. One of the positive thing about this conference was that even the non-state players like NGOs, like and the big companies, so they were also individually negotiating, and they were setting up their own target, and they promised to cut down the emission by replacing the old technology with the greenhouse technology or with the green technology. And there were nearly promises made by 187 countries to stabilize the temperature around which will stabilize the temperature around 2.7 to 3.5 degrees Celsius. Nearly 1 degree Celsius of warming has already taken place, and the reversing that process is not very clear. Countries will, and here the provision of the Paris agreement is that the countries will account for, report and review their actions periodically. Every 5 years, these countries are supposed to measure the kind of amount of emission which they have done, and they also need to inform the expert committee how they are going to cut down the emissions in the future. So, that is one of the important achievements of Paris conference. Countries' implementation in many cases is conditional to national interest, and financial support from rich countries. The cutting down of emission in the developing countries has also been linked to the kind of financial support or the amount of financial support which are going to come from the developing world. And this linking was not there earlier, and the developed countries were not willing to commit to this kind of linkage. But in this conference, the achievement of this conference is that some kind of linkage was established, and this will also be reviewed periodically, that how much of actual commitment of finance that has actually been delivered to these countries. So, that has been accepted by the developed countries, and that is the reason Paris conference is different and unique from other countries. Countries like India and Australia, so they promised to start cutting down the emission by 2030. Now, it is important to understand that why Paris conference succeeded while the similar conferences that happened in Copenhagen and Kyoto that failed. First important thing to understand is that there was a change in perception of climate change from long term to an immediate threat. Earlier it was believed, and most of the people or the experts argued, that although climate change is taking place, but the impact would be seen in a very long term, and it was not immediate. But recently, now because of the researches, because of the studies which are being done, so they came to conclusion that there is already the visible impact of climate change in the contemporary situation. Excuse me. So, climate change, which was taken as a long term threat, and that now became an immediate threat, and there were certain empirical evidences which were projected by the researchers. One was, for instance, the kind of forest fire which took place in a number of places like Indonesia. In 2010 it happened in Russia. Then there was a flood in Miami which was unexpected. Then there was drought in Texas in 2012, and in Australia in 2014. And there is also some kind of changes in the monsoon. So, these were the empirical evidences which were shown, or which kind of which were taken to argue that climate change is already taking place and the adverse impact of climate change is visible. So, we cannot delay it any further. So, there was a kind of urgency which was given to the issue of climate change, and that's the reason most of the countries agreed to come to the table. And also the kind of pollution level which was shown in cities like Beijing and New Delhi. So, that also kind of facilitated the urgency of this in the negotiation on the climate change. The second important thing was that bridging the gap, bridging the divide between US and China. In previous conferences, US and China used to take just the opposite position. US will argue that no, China should be treated same as the developed world, but China would argue that China is a developing country. The requirement of Chinese energy is very different from United States and other countries, and therefore, China should not be treated as a developed world, and China should have a special privilege in the sense that China should be allowed to fix its own target, and China should be given support in terms of financial support and also technology. So, China, but in this conference China agreed to identify one level peaking level emission. China has set up the target 2030 as the year from which it will start cutting down the emission, and US also agreed to provide some kind of support to developing country, and the category of developing world remains, where China is still treated as one of the developing countries. And the French diplomacy, it is taken that it is argued that French diplomacy played a very proactive role in bringing about some kind of negotiation. The French president François Hollande, who worked very hard along with the ministers to negotiate with the state governments, various governments of the various countries, and they sent missions just for the issue of climate change to important countries. And also, when negotiation was taking place, then the French took care of each and every detail, right from lunches to time to sleep and time to the time to negotiate. So, these were the issues which were taken into consideration by the French diplomacy. Obama had made climate change his priority in the second term, and I quote him that he said that if Congress does not act, I will. So, that sent a very strong message to the US Congress, to the US people, and also to the world that United States is serious this time. Earlier US will support this protocol, but when it came to taking real action, so US was not willing to take any action. So, that kind of hypocrisy was not acceptable to the developing countries. But when Obama gave this kind of message, so it became very clear that US is serious. US also started regulating the emissions by the industries. So, that also sent a very positive message for the success of this Paris conference. What are the kind of broadly the achievements that we can say that the Paris conference has achieved in terms of real implementation, or the chances of the success of the implementation measures which have been accepted by various countries. And this conference struck a balance between collective will to cut emission, differentiation between developed and developing countries, and also financial resources for supporting the developing countries. Second is that it also resolved to hold temperature below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, and to pursue for a new limit which is lower than that, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Is review that every 5 years this will be reviewed. That's the third important achievement of this Paris conference. And there is a transparency, and there is a mechanism through which every country is expected to report the level of transmission and the kind of cutting which they are planning to do in the future. So, that is again very important achievement of this conference. And also there will be apart from country reviewing the mechanism of each and every country, there will be a global stock taking, that globally how much of temperature has risen, and what are the measures which are required, and how and what kind of finances which are being provided to the developing countries, and how developing countries are cutting their emissions. So these are some of the issues which are which were achieved in the Paris conference, and that made this conference very historic, unique from the previous conferences which did not succeed on this particular issue. If you see the reaction of the important leaders, Ban Ki-moon, the United Nations Secretary General, he claimed this conference to be to have the value of a monumental triumph, that is succeeded. This conference succeeded. And Obama, the President of the United States, he also said that the decisions which were taken at Paris was a landmark decision in the sense of saving the planet for the future generation, and India called it historic. Manohar Parrikar, while delivering his speech, he clearly said that this is a very historic agreement. So India also supported this Paris conference, and that is that shows that how the developed countries and developing countries, they also came to some kind of historic understanding on the issue of climate change. Now it's important to understand what are the issues that that India faces. Many of the people argue that by committing to the level of below 2 degrees Celsius, and also committing to some kind of future target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it would be difficult for India, because India is a country which is going to industrialize. India needs industrialization, and the government is coming up with plans like Make in India, which will require a lot of energy for industrialization, for creating smart cities, and for also transportation, electricity, etc. So India would be difficult for India to achieve that kind of industrialization, given the targets that have been fixed by India. By India or by the other country in this conference. The temperature goal must take into account sustainable development, poverty eradication. The developed countries, they are in this conference, developed countries decided to take lead in mitigating the efforts and to provide financial support. And India has been arguing, what is the main argument of India? India has been arguing that that India should be allowed to emit for a time, till the time it achieves some kind of industrialization. And India also argued that the targets which are set up by any conference, the targets should be differential for different countries. For instance, India is a developing country, so India's targets should be different from the countries like United States or Japan, for that matter. And that was accepted in this conference in a different way. Although the target is below 2 degrees Celsius, or achieving a target of 1.5, but here there is a provision that every country has an option of deciding what year would be the peak year for that country, and after which it can decide to start cutting down the emission. And also the fact that India wanted some kind of financial support for the developing countries, so that was kind of agreed upon. Although some of the skeptics argue that even now the most of the kind of the amount which has been fixed, that's not enough for supporting the green technology. The $100 billion from 2025, the kind of amount which has been agreed, so that's not enough for replacing the existing greenhouse emitting gases technology. So those are kind of the skeptical argument which are coming from the other side. The second is that that global stock take, if the global stock taking takes place, so people argue that India does not have even the mechanism to measure how much of gas is being emitted in India. For instance, many of the industries are very not very they do not have the technology to measure, and also the kind of because most of the people in the rural India, they still burn the fossil fuel, or they burn the wood. So how do you measure that kind of emission? So India has to develop, because India needs to report now. India, every 5 years there'll be a meeting, or there'll be some kind of review meeting by the expert committee, and every country is expected to report the amount of emission which it has done in the last 5 years. So that mechanism does not exist in India, and people argue that it would be difficult for India to implement those measures. So these are some of the arguments which people give vis-a-vis India's participation in the India's agreement, or India's decision to support this agreement. But as I told you that requirement of cooking gas, electricity, energy, that is the major issue for India. India argued for common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, because India argued that every country should have different responsibility and not the uniform responsibility compared to the developed countries. Developed countries have a different level and these countries have a different level. So these countries should have different targets and the capabilities are different. So the support system should also be different. Countries were given option to choose a peaking year. China picked up the year of 2030, but please remember that that every country, there is a realization that the global rising of global temperature will also directly impact India, because it might impact the monsoon. It also impact the crop production which takes place in India. India is a warm country, and any increase in temperature might lead to some kind of the low productivity in the crops, and also it leads to some kind of forest fires, etc. So these are some of the issues that India is facing, and the climate change is a major challenge for India, and as a result it was in larger long-term interest of India that India agreed to sign this Paris conference. So with this I come to the conclusion of this presentation. Just to sum up some of the important issues that you need to understand for the climate change. First, you need to understand that the average temperature in the global atmosphere is rising. There is already, if you compare the rise of temperature from the pre-industrial period, in the earlier period the rise has taken, there has been rise of nearly 1% already. And since the countries are not going to cut down the emission in a certain time, so if they do not take the measures, so it will lead to an increase of nearly 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius, and the threshold which has been set up by the scientists is just 2 degrees Celsius. So every country has to take responsibility to cut down the emission here, because historically the biggest emitters are the Western countries. So the Western countries need to take a larger responsibility, and major responsibility is with the countries which have already emitted millions of tons of gases in the atmosphere. So the responsibility lies majorly with the with the developed countries, but also please remember that the second largest emitter in today's world is China. So unless until China takes certain action on cutting down the emission, any negotiation or any this kind of agreement will not succeed. India is also the fourth largest emitter, although the requirement of India in terms of energy, industrialization, etc. is very high. India is even now a developing country, and a huge population is poor. So India needs to industrialize. India needs to generate more energy, but energy generation through the green technology is an option that India must try. The solar technology or the nuclear technology, these are the options that India has to explore, and India has to expand these technologies. The third important issue is the financial support. I think the important thing to understand is that the Western countries which have already historically emitted a huge amount of greenhouse gases, so they should support financially to cut down the emission, and these countries, the poorer countries, will not be in position to cut down the emission unless until the support comes from the developed world. And also the fourth is technology. Now what is happening in today's world is that most of the green technologies are very expensive, and these green technologies are being produced and being controlled by countries from the West. So unless until these countries produce transfer some technology or provide some technology to the poor countries, it's very difficult to imagine a situation where the developing countries will be in position to cut down the emission of the greenhouse gases. But it's in the future of all of us, because unless until we reverse the process, or unless until we check the process immediately, it's in the interest of humanity, it's in the interest of planet that we need to cut down the emission of the greenhouse gases. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very prolific session. As I had already said, through this session, one thing is clear: until and unless each of the country take a pledge to reduce the emission, till then we can't think of a better climatic conditions throughout the world. Now, if we are talking about Paris Climate Conference, so such type of conferences become successful only after multiple conferences which took beforehand.
Yeah, which is very true. You're asking a very important question, Geetka, because people, when Copenhagen conference failed in 2009, and people thought that this is a kind of waste of time. People started saying that this kind of negotiation will not succeed, because you have more than 190 countries, and how do you bring these countries on table? And especially when you have two powerful countries like United States on the one hand and China on the other, and they are not willing to any uniform target. So how do you bring these countries together? And they also try to, both the countries, both United States and China, they try to mobilize the other countries in their favor. So as a result, there was a huge gap which was there between the Chinese side and the United States, the developed side. But the major role was played by I think three important set of countries. One was United States, and the second was of course China, and third was the low-lying countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam, and the Maldives. So they started saying that that is very soon they are going to submerge, right? And unless until some kind of action is taken to control or to check this emission of the greenhouse gases, otherwise it would be very difficult. This will lead to a very catastrophic kind of impact on these states. So these three actors played a very, very important role, and we should also acknowledge that the French, as I told you, the diplomacy played a very important role. That they started saying that it became a kind of the prestige issue for the French. They wanted to prove a point. They wanted to say that Hollande wanted to take a historic credit for that. So Hollande and his team worked really, really hard to bring these countries on table. And also because Obama, this is the last term of Obama, this is the second term, and he realized that if he wants to leave a legacy, because he is not going to come for the third term, so he can take certain actions which might be adverse which may not be acceptable to the US, since he is not going to the public election again. So he also took a very positive and very strong measure, and that's the reason this Paris conference succeeded.
That's what we have predicted, and that's what we have always wanted, that everything should be in the productivity of the entire world. Now, if we talk about the global warming, which is the major cause of the pacts and the conferences we have been talking here, global warming, it's just not an issue related to the climate. This has become an issue with the economies of the world, with the underdeveloped and developed countries, where the developed countries tend to be developed and the underdeveloped countries are still underdeveloped or less developed. So if all the countries in the world would not come into a common compliance, such as signing the pacts and taking the pledge to reduce emissions, so can we say that yes, the economic countries, the economy boosting countries, will they be at the peak and the less will be at the lesser side?
I'll go beyond what you said, and some of the people argue that this entire debate and the discussion on the climate change is harsh. In my university also, for instance, some of the people argue that climate change is not taking place. But and they say that this is a kind of mechanism, this is an instrument through which the developed countries can sell their green technologies, and also could put some pressure on these countries to change the technology. And since the green technology is controlled by the companies from United States and developed countries, so it's a politics of green technology which is being played out rather than the real issue of climate change. But to be very honest, there are two sides of it. But by and large, I'll go by the majority of the scientists which believe. A majority of the scientists, they do believe that climate change is taking place, and it's not exactly linked to economy, although economy has contributed to the rise of this greenhouse gases and the consequent global warming. But most of the scientists, in fact the mainstream scientists, they do believe that the temperature is rising and we need to take certain actions. For instance, this year, if you see this year in India, there is no winter. Technically, even New Delhi, for instance, New Delhi or in other places, there was no winter. So this is taken as El Nino year, or some of the people say that this is the impact of the climate change. Climate change is such a huge issue that the kind of empirical evidences that you find very sporadic and very they're very limited, and the kind of evidences that you have that are still at the level of hypothesis. So the conclusion, giving conclusion is very different, but I'll go by the majority of the scientists, which they argue that temperature has risen, and there is no doubt that the temperature has risen in the last 100 years. As I told you, that temperature has risen by 1%, and the threshold which has been set up by the scientists, they say that 2% is the threshold. So you cannot move beyond 2%. So that would be very devastating for the entire planet. So 2% has been set up, and I think also the fact that if you live in a metropolitan city, like here, controlling the pollution is also an important issue. So if it's happening for this in the name of climate change, or also in the name of the politics of climate change, so there is no harm in controlling some of the issues, right? So it is for the benefit of the existing people, and also is for the benefit of the future generation. If you cut down carbon dioxide, you're also cutting down some kind of pollution, and pollution is affecting all of us, as you know. So it's very important that we understand that climate change is an issue which needs to be supported, and some kind of perception has to be created through which public put pressure on the politician to take certain measures.
Nobody has ever thought of that pollution or the global warming could become a part of the international politics, but yes, it has become, and now we are trying to solve the entire questions which have been raised around us. What are those circumstances, and what are those conditions, or what are the general perception where countries refuses to sign such treaties or the pacts?
See, some of the countries are and the people, they are beneficiary of the climate change. Let me tell you that. For instance, in Russia, for instance, if the temperature rises, and if the entire the snow-clad region of Siberia and other regions in Russia, for instance, they become if the ice melts, so that becomes available for agriculture. So countries like Russia and countries like Norway, Sweden, etc., for the people, for general people, it's difficult to they thought that this will lead to some kind of this would be beneficial for the agriculture of Russia, and they had this kind of perception for a very, very long time. In US, because US thinks that the kind of dominance that it has, US is the biggest emitter, as you know, and as a result, people feel that if there is a check on the emission of the greenhouse gases, so that might impact the industries in the United States, because your industry becomes expensive, and shifting the technology would also mean that some kind of unemployment will take place. So there are people in the United States also who think that this climate this negotiation is not in the interest of the people. But in India, China, because if you put a target, or if you limit the emission, that in the kind of industrialization that we're expecting in the next few years, so people fear in India, China also, that it may not be in the short-term interest of these countries. But always we cannot think of just the short-term interest. Please remember that we have a long-term interest, and this is related to the issue of survival of the planet, the kind of arguments which are being given. So that's issue of survival of the planet, because if there is a huge rise in the temperature, so that means the entire Bangladesh will shift, and if people from Bangladesh shift, where will they go? They'll come to a place like India. So it's in the interest of India that the climate India support this climate change, and also people, gradually the perception will change. A few years back, nobody thought that ordered event scheme will succeed in Delhi.
Definitely.
But the fact that it has succeeded, so that has given some kind of optimism and hope to the people that if we take certain measures, so that might be helpful for the people in the long term.
Definitely, very well said and very well quoted also, as you said that every country should think for the survival of the planet. Of course, every country think for the survival, sustainability and livelihood of the country, but going beyond our own personal motives, we should work for the Mother Earth, and should continuously work out, talk so that something beneficial could be brought about. So we would like to thank Dr. Rajan Kumar for having a very vivacious session with us, and dear friends, we would like to tell you all that we will be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on one another topic in the area of international studies. And if you want to access this lecture, then very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube, and for your queries and your feedback, definitely you can revert us back at info.cec@nic.in. So with this note, we are taking your leave. Thank you so very much. Thank you, sir.